Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Duke Reads in the year 2009. Tonight I'm very pleased to have Reynolds Price, Duke class of 1955, James B. Duke, Professor of English at Duke, here to discuss Isaac Denison's Out of Africa. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Professor Price is in his 51st year of teaching. I'm always surprised to see that. 51st year of teaching at Duke, is well known to many as a teacher and a writer, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, has written 37 volumes of fiction, poetry, memoir, essays, and plays to international acclaim. Later this spring, Ardent Spirits, his 38th book and a memoir, scheduled to be published. And we're going to talk about Out of Africa, Isaac Denison. And your first question intrigued me because I thought I was supposed to find the answer to that in the book, and I kept going back over it. How did I miss it? Let's talk about that. Could we have gained more if Denison had written more freely about her experiences with venereal disease?
Well, I assume that we could have. I mean, venereal disease was so important in her family that her own father committed suicide when he discovered he had it many years earlier than she. And there's really some question now amongst her biographers as to whether there was some kind of family genetic connection. It's always been assumed that her husband, Bror Blixen, who was a bit of a Danish son of a bitch, gave it to her because he was known to be quite a womanizer. Very likely that is what happened, but she was just told one day when she went to the doctor in Nairobi, and she betook herself back to Denmark, her native country, for treatment, and spent the rest of her life getting treated at intervals, and apparently eventually, as a very old lady, died of it.
Well, we do have a response. Joanna said, if Denison had written more freely of her experience with VD, we might have had a better way to measure the number of people affected by VD from the time that book was written to the present. Her description of the prevalence of AIDS could have served as a baseline for today's figures, and that's to question one, so I'll stop there. So she didn't do it, but that answer implies that one of the things she was trying to do was sort of give us that broader picture. Well, maybe you could respond directly to that, but it raises a question in my mind.
Let me just glance at it. Right?
Sure.
Good. We might have a better opinion. Yeah, we know very little about the number of people who were affected, especially the number of women who were affected. The men weren't quite so shy about discussing it. I mean, I wrote a short article for the Washington Post a few years ago, a special issue that they did on AIDS in literature, and I began investigating the number of people who had died of AIDS who were writers or artists of one sort or another. And of course, it was devastating in all the Western countries as far as arts of all sorts were concerned. Again, we know very little about the effect of women, and when I went back and was having studied the AIDS toll, I then went back into the 19th century and began to realize what an enormous number of the 19th century geniuses of Europe, Western Europe especially, and a few in England, none in America that I could establish beyond doubt had died of it, but an extraordinary number of very large figures like Baudelaire and Maupassant and so forth. And Schubert, the great composer. And it was just this terrible thing that came through Europe in sort of waves and took very large numbers of people out with it.
And of course, nothing to stop it until the invention of sulfa drugs and ultimately antibiotics in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, in the mid-1940s, yeah.
Well, but both of these questions in this response raise the question about what kind of book this is and what kind of book it isn't. It doesn't give us the epidemiological history or the history of disease, nor is it a very deep account of her emotions and her emotional response to Africa itself.
Well, and certainly, it tells us very little about how she responded to her doctors telling her that she had syphilis. It tells us absolutely nothing about what she then turned to her husband and said, right. Assuming that he was the man who had given it to her. And nor that she would have said to any of her family when she returned to Denmark to be treated for it, in whatever years that would have been, the late teens or early 20s. And the treatment in those days was very largely a very, very damaging treatment that could involve arsenic and lead. And those apparently were substances that were very toxic and built up in her body through the years, and are widely thought of as having been what ultimately killed her, though she had lived a long life. I mean, I think she was at least in her late 70s when she died. But the official cause of her death in Denmark was listed on the death certificate as
was it anorexia?
Starvation, anorexia, because her digestive tract had broken down so severely as a result of all of these terrible medications. There was a great study was done within the last decade as to the persistent question of whether Beethoven died of it or not.
Right.
And there was a lock of Beethoven's hair that he gave to some family in Austria, and they had kept it in a little sort of sealed frame, and it was its credentials were very credible. I mean, we had no reason to think it wasn't actually Beethoven's hair, and I think it was two American men who bought it in an auction at Sotheby's or Christie's or somewhere, and they had studies done of it to find out whether or not there were big deposits of arsenic or lead. And sorry, I can't tell you what the answer was. If any of our listeners does know, call in. But
we'll have to Google that
obviously
right now.
He went stone deaf when he was in his early 30s. So there was something wrong with him, clearly.
Well, we can certainly expect that a woman would not have been a proper subject for a woman to be writing about.
No, even at the date of its composition, it wouldn't have been, no.
But to the other question about her emotional presence in this book, did you find, I certainly felt a little that she was a bit detached. She certainly had deep thoughts and deep feelings about it, but I never felt them.
I suppose I did more than you, Frank, because with the intensity with which she looked at the world around her in Africa, especially after she's essentially a solitary woman living out there on this farm 12 miles from Nairobi. And the way that, for instance, she will take this boy Kamante, whom she writes about very early in the book, this young African boy, Kikuyu boy, and he has terrible skin disease of some sort on his legs in his pre-adolescent years. And ultimately she can't treat him herself, though she tries. She describes herself as, she's like all good quacks, she said. I had a rather large history of success. But she couldn't heal Kamante, and ultimately she took him into a hospital. And they did, over a period of months, manage to heal this little boy. And he came back to her house and became her chef and cooked for her for the rest of her stay in Africa, which was more than 20 years later. But I think that she reveals to in the closeness of observation with which she tells us about some of the Kikuyus, the Maasai, etc., even down to her observation of certain kinds of animal, the gazelles, the elephants. I don't know, I think that the degree to which she's watching closely does to me suggest there's an awful lot of feeling there. But as you say, she never mentions having a feeling.
She never
says, I went to my room and sobbed uncontrollably, which you or I would have said probably in some form or other, but she doesn't do that.
Do you think that is a result of again, the times and the fact that she was a woman and this would have been unseemly? Oh, the last thing a woman needs to do as an author is to cry in the middle of a book. That's just what these men are expecting? I mean,
Well, Frank, I also think, and again, if we have any people in the audience who can bring us up to speed on this, I think it had a lot to do with her being Scandinavian. Someone told me years ago, he said, how to tell Danes from Swedes from Norwegians. And he said that there was a shipwreck and 2 Danes, 2 Swedes, and 2 Norwegians were shipwrecked on a desert island. They weren't rescued for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, they were found. And the two Norwegians had had a fight, and one had killed the other. The two Danes had formed a cooperative and were doing quite nicely. And the two Swedes hadn't been introduced yet. Well, she's a Dane, not a Swede or a Norwegian. But I do think, and I've known a lot of, and I've spent time in all those countries, and I think there's a great reserve. They make the English look positively show-offy, but
and
that's maybe a portion of what was going on here.
Certainly was a good scientist, as you said, as an anthropologist. The ability to see the differences and even to recognize them almost makes her seem a little progressive for her time, to say, no, the Somalis are like this and the Maasai are like that. And so to recognize the subtle differences in culture, which may have been lost on the average settler, I would guess,
I'm sure.
in the early part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
We're taking all your questions and comments about the book. Of course, we have Reynolds Price has given us 5 questions that we can talk about as a kind of a guideline, but we're certainly interested in any of the thoughts that you might have on Out of Africa as we continue our discussion. Should we move to question 2? Let's talk about this. Should we assume that she and Dennis Finch Hatton were physical lovers? What was yours? You know, again, the question came to me as I was 3/4 of the way through the book, and I thought, oh, that never occurred to me.
I know.
But why not? Why, they're sharing the house, they're having dinner, he comes home to her after all these things.
Exactly.
And my goodness, it never occurred to me that they might be engaged that way.
And I think, as far as the book is concerned anyway, we can't answer the question.
Right.
But then we can't answer it about an enormous number of women in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries at least, who wrote about their lives.
Right.
They just don't tell us. I mean, how many women take off their knickers in Jane Austen?
Good point.
The answer is 0.
Well taken.
In fact, one of my great teachers at Oxford University, Lord David Cecil, who knew more about Jane Austen than Jane Austen did, said to me once, he said, have you ever noticed that Jane Austen never allows a man to be alone in a scene in an Austen novel? Because presumably she didn't know what men did when women left the room.
There's that.
And she wasn't going to put any money on guessing.
It was the Ozzie and Harriet approach to literature, I suppose. We have Cam Lawler has done a little research for us and found out that many sources believe that Beethoven's death was the result of liver failure due to cirrhosis, and that was confirmed by an autopsy performed by Johann Wagner and Karl von Rokitansky.
That's interesting.
So there you go, liver disease. But again,
and cirrhosis would imply that there'd been a fair amount of alcohol involved, which there may have been.
There is non-alcoholic cirrhosis as well, but who knows? Anyway, thank you for that, Cam, and stand by. The more questions I'm sure will arise as we continue this conversation. Why does she include these things? It's fascinating to me. It could have been an anthropological kind of geographical study, and it's brilliant for that. And her own rumination and reflections are intellectually sound, and I thought stimulating. But she includes these tantalizing, possibilities and relationships that, sort of aren't part of that.
I know.
What kind of a book is this, and what isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there are numerous black men, young men, and slightly older black men, Somali, Kikuyu, Maasai, with whom she has very close relationships as the mistress of the household, and she's either their employer or, in some sense, they live on the land that for a while she's got a deed to, and there are real possibilities that there are relations now. But I know, as a man who was born in the American South, eastern North Carolina, in 1933, I know very well that the main thing you could never say was that a white woman might have had a sexual relationship with a black man. It was hard enough to admit that a lot of white men had bred mixed racial children, but you could never say the other half of that proposition.
And yet she felt free to write about being a white woman alone on this farm with a number of African men.
And never expresses fear of them, does she? That I can recall.
What do you suppose was her intention in writing this book at that time, given the way travel and anthropological works were framed? You know, most of them seemed, when you read those tracts, they seem outright racist, and a little bit narrow-minded about their subjects. And they seem much more open-minded than...
She's much more open-minded. I think, I'd be curious to know whether she needed money. I mean, you know, how much money she might have had when she got back to Denmark and had separated from Baron Blixen. But over and beyond that, I mean, I think she just was a born observer, which is the main thing, I think, that above all else, writers begin life being. And sooner or later, you get sort of this overload of what you've watched and registered in the world. And you start wanting to say something about it. And I think that must have been very large in her feeling when she comes back to Denmark from Africa and has left this beautiful landscape. And I mean, that wonderful first sentence that many people quote, I had a farm in Africa at the foot of the Gong Hills, period. Now, she doesn't necessarily write sentences that are that rhetorically uncomplicated. But if you look at this one, it's more complicated than it looks. I, not we, not my husband and I had in the past a farm in Africa, a very large continent, ranging from Morocco to the very tip of the bottom, at the foot of the Gong Hills. Well, not many people who haven't lived in Africa know where the Gong Hills are. I had to certainly get out an atlas to find out. But that, I think, tells us a lot about why she wrote the book. She had it in the past. She alone had it. I had it. And there it was. And she ends the book with the sentence which has the Gong Hills in it again.
Well, and she has, while you're finding that, certainly she's more than an observer and a scientist because of her great literary sense. She makes a number of literary references. The Odyssey plays an important part in the beginning and then on throughout the book. So she has a feel for literature, and you can sense, I sense the pulse of a novel trying to sort of come through this memoir.
And to the best of my knowledge, I haven't read all of her fiction by any means, but to the best of my knowledge, she wrote no extensive fiction set in Africa. A lot of it, the vast majority, as far as I know, set in Western Europe. But why was there none? I mean, was there a feeling on her part that in order to set any fiction in Africa, she would have to open up emotionally much more than she does?
I think any good
memoir.
You know that better than anybody. I think when you engage in fiction, that's when you have to open yourself emotionally.
Exactly.
Joanne has an observation or question here that I think is apropos, which is how it's interesting that one couldn't tell the author was a male or a female until about page 86. Again, not wanting to disclose anything at all about herself, even her gender.
I think that's a very fascinating observation of Joanne's, because I mean, one of the things that I, as a teacher of would-be young writers for, as you pointed out, 51 years, I, as a teacher, have been fascinated through those decades to observe the differences between young female would-be writers and young male would-be writers. Professor Blackburn, who taught writing at Duke for 1,000 years and was the only writing teacher I ever had, Professor Blackburn said to me when I came back here to teach, he said something a little startling. I was talking to him about a young woman who had been in my first freshman class who happened to be named Ann Tyler. And yes, it was the Ann Tyler, and she was 16 years old when she walked into my first class. And I went into Blackburn and raved about the first 2 or 3 papers that she wrote for me, which I've read over again very recently, and know how extraordinary how they were, and frankly, how right I was about them. And I talked to Blackburn about this, and when I was 25, 26, which is when I would have been having that luncheon with Blackburn, and he would have been a great deal older than that, about 30 years older than I, 35 years older than I, and I was going on about Miss Tyler, which we called our students in those days, Mr. or Miss, and he said, well, Reynolds, he said, I must warn you. He said, don't get too excited about any young woman who wants to write. And I said, why? And he said, because in 4 years they'll graduate. They'll marry very shortly thereafter. They'll have children very rapidly, and that'll be the end of any desire to write or any time available for writing. Right. Well, there was a bit of truth in that, in that era. We're talking about the late 1950s. But he presented it to me as a sort of universal warning that I must have. And if I look back at the students that I've had who've become successful writers of fiction or poetry or playwriting, I think the males have a very slight numerical lead, but nothing at all dramatic these days. And certainly the women that I know who've succeeded very well and who've written extraordinarily good fiction, like Ann Tyler and Josephine Humphreys, they've also had a fair number of children. Ann's had 2 daughters, and Joe's had 2 sons. And they've gone on about being, relatively active in their own communities. And has a lovely essay she wrote long years ago about wanting to be a writer and becoming a writer as a young woman. And she said she used to go to school to pick up one of her daughters in the afternoon at the time school ended, and there was always a woman there that she met, and then they didn't know each other well, but they would sort of chat while they waited for the bell to ring. And finally one day the woman said to her, have you got a job yet, or are you still writing?
Well, there is that.
There's that.
But so once you sort of get over that prejudice, the other prejudice that perhaps accounts for the fact that women are more successful these days may be less a question of time than our acceptance of sort of reading about allowing them to be emotionally available to us and talking about more intimate matters.
I think there is. And I do think also, maybe we talked about this last year when we were doing this, but I do think that one of the things that I've noticed increasing, and one of the things that in classes of mine I've urged young women to do, is to, in their fiction, try to think as much as possible about the men and male psychology. Because if we do look, I mean, it's a cliche now to say that there are great novels about women written by men, Madame Bovary by Flaubert, Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Hardy, etc., 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 Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. But you really get way on into the 19th century before you begin to have any books by a woman which are centered on a male psyche, and they still remain scarce. And I don't know, I have one sort of reason for thinking about this, but I remember again saying that to Lord David Cecil at Oxford 50 years ago, why this is true. And he said, I think there's a simple answer. He said, men are reared by women, so are women. So men get this profound introduction to the opposite gender, whereas many women don't get any introduction to the male gender.
Well, we could have a long, 2 or 3 hour long discussion on that, because I have the feeling that any group who finds themselves not the dominant group, if you're a subordinate group, as women have been held subordinate in our culture, it's your job to know more about the psyche of the dominant group than they know about themselves.
Yeah.
Whether they reflect it or ever express it in literature, maybe another question for another time, but I would have to disagree that they don't. I think they have to know more. I think any subordinate group, it makes it their living to know.
I think it's highly likely. I also think that we could argue all night, but I could point out that there are very few novels by women which have central male characters.
And that would be an interesting question.
Yeah.
If I'm right, then they know a lot. Then why doesn't it show up in the books? Maybe that's because you don't want to. That's because you don't want to disclose your trick. It's like intelligence.
You're always right, Frank.
Oh, I'd love to talk with you. Let's talk about the next point. Could we have guessed that her native language was Danish? She writes in English, right? And this is a fascinating thing. Talk about that.
I mean, I framed the question. Could you have guessed?
No, not at all. No. Her prose is.
Nor could I.
Yeah.
Nor could I have guessed the very bizarre fact that apparently most often she wrote in English first and translated her English into Danish.
I was surprised to hear that.
To have the books published in Denmark. No, it's extraordinary. Every now and then, I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe I should have noted down page numbers, but every now and then, maybe 10 times in the entire novel, I would run across something that seemed to me slightly awkward or slightly strange, but no, I could never have guessed that this was a Dane.
Why do you suppose she wrote in English first, not her native language?
Can't imagine. Now we know, for instance, that Tolstoy and Russian writers like Turgenev and Tolstoy, upper class Russian writers of the 19th century, in their families spoke English much more often than they spoke Russian. Russian was something you used for speaking with the servants. And at the dinner table, you and mother and father spoke English. And in the first pages of War and Peace, there are a number of sentences in the English language because it's an aristocratic conversation that's being conducted. But as far as I know, Tolstoy never wrote a whole book in English, or even a story for that matter, but apparently his English was extremely fluent. But no, I don't know how many other Danes, how many members of her family would have been, very fluent English
Well,
teachers.
Hamlet spoke in English.
Absolutely.
So there's that.
Couldn't be stopped.
Well, eventually.
The other Dane, the other literary Dane.
She really does have a gift for language, and it's possible that she found that it was just a more expressive language for her. Who knows? Maybe she did consider it. But she is a gifted writer. And again, that's still the puzzle. She's so clear. And you think about this book being written in 1936. It was published, I think. It could have been a dry anthropological tract. It could have been a travel log, which would have seemed stilted and difficult to read, and yet it's so accessible, so conversational. And I get back to this, well, why wouldn't she let on about how she felt? But we won't go back. Let's talk a little bit more about this. I guess continue and move on to point 4 and spend some time with it. Allowing for the emotions of the early 20th century, how do you see Denison's portrayal of African black people?
Yeah. Well, I wish we'd get a lot of messages from our readers on that subject.
I may have skipped. Do you know what? Do you want? I may have.
Do we have any?
Well, do you know what? I may have missed a point. I think Joanne had something on the third question. Did she? And what did I do? Oh, you asked to borrow.
Really interesting.
Do you have it? And she may have had an answer on the third point, and we might have missed it.
Here we go. Here's.
Yeah, it's on that sheet. Number 3. I thought her writing and grammar were excellent. This is Joanne, and I thought she sounded British, so she's pretty much confirmed what I said. I wanted to make sure we got that in. But onward now to this question of her portrayal of African people. What do you think?
One other thing for Joanne before we go to the African people.
Sure.
I think that I've read very recently that one of her governesses when she was a little girl was a British woman, and that may explain a lot. Well, I'm another member of the white, there's no such thing as a white race, but let's say there is tonight. I'm a white man, a white person who grew up in a culture surrounded by large numbers of African American people. In Warren County, North Carolina, where I was born, when my parents had been born and all of us reared, when I was born in 1933, according to the U.S. Census from 1930, the population of Warren County was about 65 or 70% black. So I had an awful lot of time in the company of black people and was to a large extent reared in the company of two African American people who very likely were born slaves. They didn't know exact birth dates for themselves, but it was very close to 1865, one side or the other of abolition. Anyway, so that, you know, I'm hardly the oldest man you could meet in Durham, but you could say that Reynolds may have been partly reared by people who were born slaves in the United States, and we're about to inaugurate the first black president. Say what you will about problems in America, that's very fast moving as history goes. I felt an extraordinary warmth on her part toward these people. As you and I said a few moments ago, no fear whatever of living alone with black people all around her. She mentions once or twice black men walking into her bedroom at night when something was wrong on the farm, and she doesn't seem to have been alarmed by that, whatever. And Kamante, the little boy, comes into her room one night and says, "Mem Sab, wake up, God is coming." And he took her down to the window and showed her this huge fire moving toward the house through the dried grass. And she had to explain to him that it was a form of God, but it wasn't God that he as he thought of God. I mean, she never, for a moment, says or gives you the idea that she doesn't feel that she's a member of the ruling race, does she?
Well, we're on a border there. Certainly the warmth that she felt, the openness that she felt, and was clear and probably more open-minded than you can expect for people at that time. There was a kind of a patronizing tone now and then, but I have to say, what she did that you don't expect from white people of that time, from the reading I've done, is to give absolute credibility and validity to the customs and the culture of people at the time, and not have been so dismissive. So when she talks about the power of storytelling and how one must speak in terms of stories in order to get across, it's not in a dismissive way. It's not, oh, these people have no capacity for reason, and so they're them and they're. She was absolutely open to the thought that this is a perfectly legitimate and equal way of navigating the world. And to that extent was much more open than you'd expect.
Absolutely. And then these very different kinds of behavior, such as, I've forgotten the name of it, but when the older black men sort of assemble in their dozens on her lawn to present her with a request or a farewell when she's about to leave, etc. If I try to think of that happening to, say, one of my aunts in Warren County, I think they would have been touched by it. I also think they might have thought it was more amusing than she appears to have thought these strange customs were. It's fairly normal, isn't it? At least before political correctness struck us down, it's usual for members of one race or one particular kind of group to find a good deal of humor. Right. I mean, the Czechs may find the Irish funny or vice versa.
You apparently find the Swedes hilarious.
Swedes are hilarious. No, yes, it hadn't been introduced yet. It's a wonderful story. By the way, a story told to me by a Swede long years ago. Yeah, I think she's immensely remarkable in that sense. And we look back and think, gosh, you know, she got out there in, what was it, right after, or just before the First World War, I believe.
Right. No, the war breaks out while she's there.
Right.
She's shuffled off into camps, and
Yeah, she was married in 1914 and continued to live there until 1931. Yeah.
We certainly welcome your comments now as we continue our conversation on Out of Africa. And this is, I think, one of the more interesting questions about, and I think it, as much as anything, reflects the scope and depth of her intellect. Joanne notes that Denison was friendly, worked closely with African natives. She seemed to recognize the strengths and unique characteristics, talents, and traits of the various tribes. I mean, a very good point that she's able to see these distinctions that I think other European visitors were all lost on.
Absolutely.
The natives, you know. And she was not prejudiced, was Joanne's observation.
Yeah.
It was probably a pretty good one. I was amazed at how, you know, first of all, when you think about her intellect and the breadth of her thought. You remember when the young Swahili man was teaching her to count in Swahili?
Yeah.
He skips 9.
9.
And of course, he's learned long ago that it sounds like a dirty word in Danish, and I only laugh, so skip it. She doesn't know this, and then begins to ruminate on the possibility of a number system without 9.
Without 9.
And why would you do this? And what an ingenious system. So again, giving full credibility to the possibility that somebody had invented this system, and it was perfectly reasonable to do, instead of saying, what's wrong with the Swahilis for dropping their 9. Manisha Desai says, I found her portrayal of Africans to be very sensitive. I was surprised to read on websites about Denison that any condescension on her part should be excused because of the time she lived in. Overall, I found very little condescension, especially given the era and the treatment of Africans on other parts of the continent at that time. A telling example is her description of the Belgian on the ship with her. Oh, yeah, the Belgian on the ship with her, who was quite disdainful of Africans. She certainly, that's a good point. She had no patience at all for that.
None.
How was this book received? Do we know when it was first published?
I don't know. I know, for instance, that she was enormously admired by all sorts of American writers, and when Hemingway won the Nobel Prize, I guess in the late 1950s, he said with a kind of courtliness that he didn't frequently display that Isaac Denison certainly was more deserving of it than he.
Wow.
Of course, she never won, but then it's given by Swedes, so maybe they didn't want to give one to Norwegian, to Danes.
You are in so much trouble. Anita Marmaduke says, I understand there's a contemporaneous book written by another woman who fancied Dennis, her perhaps lover, and therefore might have been considered Isaac's rival. Are you familiar with that book? I've forgotten the title. And if so, does the author mention or describe Isaac or her relationship with Dennis in her book?
Well, gosh, I wish the lady, our friend who's just sending that information, would let us find out the name of the book right away so we could race out and read it. No, I have not read it and don't know that. But Dennis clearly was a bit of a man of mystery, which is probably a sort of seductive quality that he wove or extruded around himself. I've seen photographs of him. He was a very handsome man. And he
But not exactly Robert Redford.
No, not exactly Robert Redford.
Who, did you see the movie? You saw the movie?
I saw the film,
I did not see the film.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. And there's another one of Meryl Streep's extraordinary imitation accents that she specializes in doing,
And Robert Redford thankfully did not.
Robert Redford didn't try to sound British, no.
Try an accent. You know, that's something to speculate. What would the novel be coming out of this? I mean, can you imagine the ways that you could take this, given the time that's passed since, and sort of weaving in? I mean, I can imagine writing the novel about the writer trying to create the novel.
Yeah,
it would be a lot of fun.
And did she have any sense? I mean, I have no idea, but would she and Dennis have had any holding back in their emotional relationship simply because they were so surrounded by people from other cultures and other races? Was there a thought that their secrets, quote unquote, might have been sort of passed on in the marketplace by Kikuyus or Messiah, whomever, if they slept in the same bed out there on the farm. I don't know. I have no idea what.
Oh, but you have to imagine that they knew, that they would have known that anything that they did would have been currency.
It would have been
native
currency.
population.
No, exactly.
I mean,
and that these people were probably, had they known something, they probably would have handled it kindly if they themselves had not been mistreated mistreated because of the relationship in some way.
Yeah.
And Dennis seems to have had the kind of sympathy with African people that she had.
Well, and she talked. Was it who was it that died? And she talked about all time being reckoned, around the birth and death of one of the other travelers in this book, the passersby. So clearly there are some sympathetic characters in here, but a lot of them aren't. And she's not very patient with Europeans who don't get life on the continent of Africa and are there simply to exploit it.
Absolutely.
She's not preachy about that, and again, why not? Why isn't she more sort of outraged about that, the exploitation of Africa? She doesn't seem to be concerned about that, and yet you kind of expect her to be, or I did. Maybe that's because I'm in where I am in time.
Well, she was so the whole world, as so far as dinner parties and social events and doctors and nurses, etc., depended on other white people, and I suppose that there was a certain amount of like having to be careful that she didn't offend. I did want to, speaking just of her language, I did want to look at this one paragraph at the end of a paragraph that I mentioned, the actual episode when little Camante comes into her bedroom one night. One night after midnight, he suddenly walked in my bedroom with a hurricane lamp in his hand, silent, as if on duty. Then he tells her that I think you had better get up. I think that God is coming, and it ends. The paragraph ends. She says, I stood for some time and looked at it. This is this huge grass fire, with Camante walking by my side. Then I began to explain the thing to him. I meant to quiet him, for I thought that he had been terribly frightened. But the explanation did not seem to make much impression on him one way or the other. He clearly took his mission to have been fulfilled when he had called me. Well, yes, he said, it may be so, but I thought that you had better get up in case it was God coming. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the interesting things, again, in the book that I've dealt with as a white man writing about a number of black characters in the United States, and that is how she's going to deal with their actual use of the English language herself, because they do speak it to their masters and mistresses. And she doesn't try to make them sound cute or funny, or she doesn't indulge in dialect spelling, that awful thing where you knock all the G's off the ends of words and so forth. Yeah, miss, there's something coming down the road. Well, he doesn't say that in the book.
Right. She's very respectful.
She gives him the dignity of his observations,
A couple more observations. I think, is there one above it that I've missed about the potential? According to Wikipedia, Burl Markham was friends with Karen and had an affair with Dennis. Sarah Wheeler, in her biography of Finch Hatton, notes that she believes stories that Markham was pregnant by Dennis at the time of his crash. She may have been pregnant. How famous is this guy? Why do I not know him, except that everybody seems to have written a book about him?
Dennis,
yeah.
I think apparently you had the one qualification was you had to have gone to bed with him as frequently as possible. And he seems to have satisfied a number of his bedmates in that fashion. I know the name Beryl Markham, but I've read nothing by her.
The name of the book might be West with the Night. And this is where we can find all this sort of other biography and fleshing out of the fleshing out, as it were. And that's it.
To the best of my knowledge, certainly his having any standing as a well-known historical figure comes almost entirely out of Africa. Mm-hmm. And whatever these other books had to say about him, Isaac Dennison got there first.
Yeah, I see.
I'd like to point out, Frank, something that I'd never till this moment thought of, that we might spend at least 30 seconds thinking about, and that is the actual title of the book. out of Africa, why not Africa Behind Me, or My 20-Odd Years in Africa, or something? But the whole book and so much of her life comes out of Africa, out of that gorgeous landscape, which she spends the first 20 pages of the book describing, and the people, the native peoples there, with an extreme minimum about any of the other white people there, except for Dennis. It's a very interesting title once you get down to looking at it.
Well, yeah, it is, and it did occur to me once that I might have called this My Life in Africa or Life and Times in Africa, and so what does she mean, out of Africa? Because she doesn't go on to say what she derived or how any of this experience changed her life. We talked extensively about that. That's the one thing she seems to refuse to do. So what is it that came out of Africa?
And she tells us essentially nothing about her life after coming back to Denmark from Africa. And she gets back, what year did she get? She got back in 1931, and the book is copyrighted in 1937. So she was back there for at least 5 or 6 years before she publishes the book. And it can't have been a book written overnight. So, yeah, very interesting.
Well, let's move on to the next point. And again, we invite your comments and observations and deeply appreciate your research. The last question, before you read any of her fiction, try to imagine what kind she would have written. She wrote a great deal.
Yeah.
I have not. I haven't read any of her fiction.
I've read a lot of the short stories, but I haven't read any of the several novels,
Well, what do you think? Is she more available to us?
Well, do we have an answer from anybody? Did Joanne or anyone else send us a response to that?
Yes, here we go. I would imagine this is Joanne, I would imagine her fiction to be unemotional, descriptive of scenery, and would not delve into human relationships too deeply. I would think of her as a historical fiction writer. Yeah, this is to another point. I mean, that would be my guess, too. In fact, I would almost think her incapable of fiction, but obviously she's not.
No, she's not incapable of it, but one of, I think, maybe perhaps her first volume of fiction is called something like 7 Gothic Tales or 9 Gothic Tales or whatever. And they're Gothic in the sense of rather extraordinary, bizarre. In one of them, for instance, a woman acquires syphilis, believe it or not, by kissing the toe of that famous statue of St. Peter in St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome.
Wow.
And, people line up there to kiss the toe. The toe is now worn away almost completely, which she kisses right after a man who has just kissed it and infected it. And she wrote that story well before the world knew that she herself had it, or that her father had committed suicide owing to that curse.
But does she let on? I mean, is she more, again, is she more emotional? Joanne and I both feel that she may not be, that there might not be much emotion in those novels.
Well, there's one brilliantly emotional story that didn't get well known in Western Europe and America until perhaps only maybe 15 or 20 years ago, when some Scandinavian filmmaker produced a really beautiful film of a long story called Babette's Feast. And it's about a wonderful story of a French woman who leaves France in one of the revolutions of the late 19th century and winds up on a small island off the coast of one of the Scandinavian countries and takes up, just knocks on the door and takes up life being the cook for these 2 evangelical sisters who live there. And ultimately she wins a lottery in France, though she can no longer go back to France, she thinks. She has a friend who buys her a lottery ticket once a year. And she eventually makes enough money, and she comes to the 2 sisters, evangelical sisters, and says, "May I give a great party to celebrate my winnings?" And they said, well, of course, Babette. And she does. She does this wonderful, wonderful meal for the sisters and a dozen or so of their extremely conservative Christian evangelical friends. And it's a very warm and very moving story. A story that's a film that it's very hard, for instance, to sit through without the odd tear now and then. And when it was shown in America, I recall 20 years ago that in New York and Chicago and LA, for instance, you could go to certain restaurants and have the meal that Babette serves that night. This extraordinary sort of 9-course French dinner. I never myself, alas, had it, but in the film, it certainly made to seem one of the great meals of all time, and so a lot of emotion is revealed in that story. Her capacity to feel for others, to feel the feelings of others, and her own response to those feelings.
It does make you wonder what we'd have, what kind of a writer she'd have been, or even a scholar had she been born 50 years later. I think of this, this passage where she says, in some respects, though not all, in not all, the whites have filled the minds of the natives in the place of this. She's talking about that the idea of God in the mind of natives, it's on page 358. Has been replaced by white people. She's not being dismissive at all. She's not at all saying, "Oh, these silly natives." This is a keen observation about the power of a dominant class to come in and occupy a territory. It's a very keen, sharp observation. Later on, when she talks about the old women carrying loads of firewood, being resistant to disease and sort of being shelled out, this idea of this eternal, almost immortal femininity that she writes about and reflects in older Native women.
It really is wonderful.
You sort of imagine if she had the freedom to write, even 50 years later, what we would have gotten.
Yeah. But we began looking at the first sentence of the book, which mentions the Gong Hills, and here on the last page of the story, page 372, the last paragraph begins. She's on the train leaving. Forever, essentially. From there to the southwest, I saw the Gong Hills. The noble wave of the mountain rose above the surrounding flatland, all air blue. But it was so far away that the 4 peaks looked trifling, hardly distinguishable, and different from the way they looked from the farm. The outline of the mountain was slowly smoothed and leveled out by the hand of distance. And that simply expressed paragraph probably says a lot about what she felt about her own relation to the place and what you've pointed out, how distant in many ways she is from it, and the distance increases as the train pulls away from the great mountain.
Could be the writing of this book was her sort of need to keep it from ever disappearing entirely from
exactly.
What a pleasure as always. Reynolds.
Great to be with you.
Great to be with you. So grateful to Reynolds Price for being a part of Duke Reads, and you as well. Time has gone by too quickly as always. An audience reminder, this session is going to be available on iTunes in the next day or so, and then forever. But you'll have to wait a day or so. Our next session is going to be February 18th. Sam Wells, Dean of Duke Chapel, will be here. He will discuss The Towers of Trebizond by Rose Macaulay. Please send your comments in advance. Always happy to hear from you, and hope to hear from you too live during our online chat. And you can go to the website. Oh, here's another website, by the way, to go to, www.bloomsbury@Duke, all one word, bloomsbury@duke.com, to sign up for Duke In Depth. It's a weekend schedule for February 27th through the 29th, a celebration and a culmination of the year-long programs at Duke, designed to illuminate the Bloomsbury Group and showcase the Bloomsbury exhibits. And those works are going to be on, many of them, on display at the Nasher Museum of Art. So it's plenty to do in the next month, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you very much.